Welcome to Toddle's School Leaders Project. On today's episode of the podcast, we talk to Katie Cunningham, the author of Shifting the Balance, which takes a deep dive into 6 shifts you can make in your classroom to explore the science of reading. I was so excited to talk to Katie because I've heard about the science of reading everywhere, but wherever I tried to look to find information, it just felt kind of intangible. Like, is it a program? What is it? Katie really shares that this is a body of research and that these are 6 shifts for upper elementary and beyond that we can take towards using neuroscience to inform our thinking, our teaching, and learning. It was such an affirming episode, and I came away just like, oh, that it makes sense. So they're approachable shifts, but they're also transformative shifts. So let's dive right in. Katie Cunningham, I am so excited to have you here on the School Leaders Project. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks so much, Cindy. It was great to get your invitation in my email.
Well, it's such a hot topic right now, science of reading. But before we jump into it, do you want to give us a little bit of context of who you are and just the work that you're most passionate about?
I'm one of the co-authors of Shifting the Balance for Upper Elementary with my brilliant colleagues, Jan Birkins and Carrie Yates. And that work was really a labor of love over 2 years to try to get right, making reading science more accessible to elementary teachers in the upper elementary grades and beyond. So that work has really taken off and been a big driver of the partnership work that I do with schools as they look at their literacy curriculum, instruction, and assessments, and make some decisions about shifts that they need to take to make it easier rather than harder for kids to become proficient readers and writers, and to make it easier rather than harder for teachers to know what the right thing to do is.
Awesome. Well, your book is so stellar because it just makes science of reading so much more accessible. I find I hear the term all over the place, science of reading, but when you Google it or even just try to find a simple definition, it's really hard to do. So might you start us there with just defining what is the science of reading and why is it so central to our literacy practice now?
Yeah, and I think a big thing for your podcast viewers and listeners to understand is that the science of reading is not a fad. It is not a philosophy. It is not a program.
Nice.
But the definition that I really recommend folks take a close look at, and the one that I draw upon, is from the Reading League, which is a nonprofit whose mission is to advance the awareness, understanding, and use of evidence-aligned reading instruction. And they define the science of reading as a vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research about reading and issues related to reading and writing. And this research has been conducted over the last 50 years. It consists of thousands of studies across multiple languages. And it's really sought to uncover how proficient reading and writing develop in the brain, why some people have difficulty, and how we can most effectively assess and teach to improve student outcomes. And, professionally, this has kind of been the heart of my work, especially the last few years. But the knowledge base that we have from this interdisciplinary body of research, while it should have been in classrooms, it should have been in teacher ed programs, we know that it wasn't. But it's an exciting time because it's really a sea of change happening globally as this body of research becomes more accessible to the people that need it most. So I get very excited about that.
Well, I can see though how it would feel a little overwhelming as a teacher hearing this or as an admin hearing this, that there isn't a program, there isn't a take and use guide to this. It's a body of thousands of pieces of research. So would you say that your Shifting the Balance book, the 6 strategies, was that your attempt to kind of synthesize this research as much as possible?
Yeah, absolutely. And Jan and Carrie did it first with their K-2 book. Mm-hmm. And when it landed on my doorstep in 2021, I thought, this is groundbreaking, that they really took that body of research and made it accessible for teachers in K-2 classrooms or teachers working really with beginning readers. Mm. And then that book primarily focused on shifts related to the secrets of the code, although it does start with a shift on language comprehension as the basis of reading comprehension. And our 3 to 5 book does focus more on comprehension than it does the code, as children get older. But one of the major misunderstandings I think that people have about the science of reading is thinking that it's about phonics only or about word recognition only, when that is not true at all, that there's, so many components related to language comprehension and the ways in which it is critical to reading comprehension and also to writing, that sometimes gets overlooked in the conversation or the misunderstandings that people have about what the science of reading is. And when Janet Curies' book landed, it was also a time in my life where my youngest son was diagnosed with dyslexia. And I was advocating for him, and I was watching firsthand the ways that really well-intentioned, loving teachers didn't know the science. They didn't know how to teach in ways that were brain friendly. And that for children who are hardwired in a way where they need even more explicit, direct, cumulative instruction than other kids might, I was seeing the ways that things that start as academic difficulties become social and emotional ones for kids. And it usually happens around 3rd or 4th grade for a lot of children. But I also witnessed the ways that my older son, who's now a sophomore in high school, how he in many ways was built for school in a lot of ways. But over the years of his elementary career, he was pulling further and further away from books and wasn't finding a reading identity, despite it coming easily to him. So I was witnessing my children, the ways in which instruction had kind of gone wrong, although it was well-intentioned, when it didn't apply what we know about how reading happens in the brain, why some kids have difficulty, and how we can most effectively teach and assess all kids from all different kinds of literacy profiles to not only strengthen their skills, but help them find joy and engagement in the process.
I love that you circle back to joy, because I think in this era of testing and in this era of scripted curriculum, a shameful thing that's happened is that the joy and intention behind teaching kids to read gets lost. So might you talk a little bit about that, about the importance of keeping joy and our larger intentions central to our teaching process?
Yeah, it's huge. And before writing Shifting the Balance for upper elementary, I wrote a book called Start with Joy, all about how we can use what we know from the body of knowledge called the science of happiness or positive psychology. How can we apply those findings in our classrooms? And really, we need to marry what we know from positive psychology with what we know from this interdisciplinary body of research known as the science of reading. That what the findings from cognitive science and neuroscience can't be separate in our classrooms with live children from what we know about the science of happiness. Those things have to go hand in hand. And instruction can get mechanistic, right? And children feel that if there isn't intentionality around engagement and joy. And I just had an article published in this January issue of Educational Leadership all about this question. And I draw on the work of Gary Hogan, the founder of the International Justice Mission. And he says that joy is the oxygen for doing hard things in the world.
Oh.
And I just love that so much, because learning to read and spell is hard work for a lot of children. We weren't born to do it as humans, and it isn't a natural process. So if joy isn't a factor in our planning and our teaching, we make it even harder than it needs to be, because it's already hard. And I think, a message I try to share with schools that I partner with and that I try to embody is that the conditions don't have to be perfect for joyful learning to occur. It just requires being more intentional about what we mean when we talk about joy in our classrooms and our schools, and about how we can create it. And we can lean on things like cognitive science, which can offer us some solutions for doing just that. We can lean on the science of happiness for doing just that. And for example, right, we make learning more effective, engaging, and joyful when we consider things like background knowledge or vocabulary demands of the tasks we're asking kids to do. Mm-hmm. And when we can also need to consider things like working memory demands, of which there are a lot when it comes to things like writing. And we can address these challenges, right, that come from content overload or background knowledge gaps or working memory demands by being really intentional about how we address them from the start with our kids. So we can incorporate, for example, a variety of ways to front load some background knowledge in the beginning of lessons because you can't activate what you don't have.
Right.
We can use images, we can use multimedia, we can use excerpts to start to help kids to be able to have some mental Velcro. That's a term that Marilyn Adams uses to think about, how does learning happen? You need to know stuff about stuff to learn new stuff, right? And so what are the scaffolds and supports that we can bake into our planning and our teaching to give kids what they need in order to be successful? And success promotes joy.
Mastery builds
Right?
efficacy. Yeah.
Yeah. Mastery builds mastery for sure. And with that comes the feelings associated with joy. Because when we don't get access to the instruction that we need, we know we're not successful, right? We know that this is hard. And that starts to create a cycle for kids of, well, I'm not any good at this, so I'm not going to try. So then they don't get the repeated practice they need in order to reach those levels of mastery that create sustained joy rather than short bursts of joy in the moment. We're looking for sustained joy in the learning process for kids.
Oh, there's so much to unpack in what you said, but I think the central theme I'm hearing is just human-centered design and human thriving design at the center of our instruction, and keeping joy and thriving at the center, which is just gorgeous. I'd love to jump into your 6 shifts
Yep.
because I've jam-packed this conversation because I'm just so excited to talk to you. But it touches on something you mentioned earlier, just about the importance of content, the importance of knowledge. And it seems like, especially in progressive schools, it's almost like we got a mixed up message. We started to shy away from content, almost like a dirty word. So might you kind of dig into the importance of having something to understand?
Yeah, and I think a major misconception the last 20 years, especially in schools where inquiry has been the driver.
Yeah.
Inquiry is important. I'm not suggesting that it isn't. But a major misconception is that kids will just pick up content knowledge through inquiry alone. And science just doesn't support that.
Right.
And, this idea of you need to already know some things in order to learn some new things means that we have to be really intentional about the knowledge building opportunities that kids have across the curriculum. And there are, of course, diverse forms of knowledge, which we also get into in the book, right? So content knowledge is one type of knowledge, but of course, there's cultural knowledge and linguistic knowledge and other forms of knowledge that all of our students have. But when it comes to reading comprehension, we draw on all of these funds of knowledge we've had as humans, but authors will often assume that readers have particular kinds of background knowledge. And that particular kind of background knowledge is what's needed in order to make essential inferences for deeper meaning. And if you have surface level knowledge, right, it can get really difficult to dig deeper into a text or to make inferences that are hard work and that readers end up missing essential details or references the authors assume that readers will pick up on. So when we create a curriculum that is content neutral, we create conditions where kids don't have access to the funds of knowledge they need to access increasingly complex text. And what ends up happening is it ends up where kids are dependent on kind of these backpacks of knowledge they already came to school with in order to access that new learning. And you can't really inquire or think about things deeply if you don't have knowledge that undergirds that thinking in the first place. So a big shift, and why it's shift 1 in our 3 to 5 book, is because schools need to make choices about the kinds of knowledge that's going to count. And that is hard because when you center some things, you inevitably leave some things out. And so these are like complex, important conversations and decisions that schools need to make. Sometimes schools are now turning to knowledge building curriculum that makes the choices for you. There are pros and cons to that, right? Because teachers can hit the ground running with giving kids these knowledge building and vocabulary building opportunities for them to become more proficient readers. But those programs are not created with your students in mind. So there's local context, right? That's going to get lost. And some of the schools that I'm partnering with are taking a hybrid approach. They're using knowledge building programs for some of their units, and they are also maintaining some units that are signature to their context. And I think that's a really thoughtful approach to take, especially for schools for whom this idea of the importance of background knowledge in particular and its role in reading comprehension. It's really hard for teachers to create these units from scratch.
So hard.
So hard. I do think, though, so I was a PYP teacher 20 to 25 years ago, and I was doing this work. Like, that's actually what the international schools were primed for in their origin. And so in some cases, it's returning to what international schools and some private schools were always doing well to begin with.
Might I parrot back what I heard and just make sure that I don't have misconceptions here?
Yeah.
That if I'm a school leader looking to bring more intentional, essential knowledge to units,
Yeah.
I might start with a program, a purchased program that has identified essential knowledge. But then in addition to that, I would say, okay, what's my local context and how might I connect what students are learning, that foundational knowledge to detailed knowledge in our local context? Would that be a solid approach to starting this kind of work?
It's one approach. It's one approach that I find I'm supporting schools to take right now because they're making shifts away from certain programs that were less aligned to reading science, and they're trying to figure out what to do next. I also think we do want to honor teacher agency, and we want teachers to have a stake in curriculum creation. They also need to be critical consumers of any existing program. But, schools that are IB schools, another approach that they could take is looking at their units of inquiry and those larger themes like sharing the planet, where we are in the world, and looking at where essential knowledge already lives in their existing curriculum. Excuse me. And that doesn't only need to be reserved for science and social studies blocks, that should also be integrated in an interdisciplinary way with the ELA blocks. And so if those units of inquiry are really robust and a lot of decision-making has already happened about those larger universal themes and marrying them with local context, then that's also a really valuable starting place. But really looking at, have they been intentional enough about integrating those concepts and topics in a way that help serve background knowledge, vocabulary knowledge, verbal reasoning skill development in the ELA time, and marrying those two. That it's not just about inquiry and asking important questions, but it's also about helping kids gain knowledge and skills they need as readers and writers.
Well, and that's inherently a transdisciplinary approach. Yeah. So not everyone listening to this would be an IB teacher.
Yeah.
And the way that the IB does things is we have these 6 units of inquiry that we study from each discipline, right? So I'm looking at how the world works from science, from math, from literacy, all studying the same big problem. And that's a beautiful approach, is that we can say, how might literacy be used as a tool for solving the problems that we're exploring in math, and then exploring the problems that we're solving in science and social studies? So it becomes embedded and connected as opposed to siloed.
Yeah, exactly. And I was an architecture major in college, not a education major. And luckily, my thesis advisor had kind of whispered in my ear, maybe you want to become a teacher. Oh. You want to be an architect. And I was like, you're right. But then when I had my own 4th grade classroom, we had a unit. I was teaching in Manhattan, right? And I was designing a unit that's about where we are in the world. I think that was the theme. And so we studied architecture. Cool. And it made sense, right? That because children were growing up in this particular context, that we researched and visited famous skyscrapers and other buildings in New York. We took field trips where we headed out to the streets with our clipboards and pencils and learned how to do architectural drawings. We had guest speakers who were architects and learned about what they did. And we also read the novel From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler, which was a Newbery winner. several decades ago, where the two main characters run away from home and they sleep over in the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Oh,
And so the novel we were reading about was also, the setting was this famous building in the city the children I was teaching were growing up in. And so we were applying all of our literacy skills and strategies to the reading of that novel, but it was also connected to what we were doing in science and social studies in this transdisciplinary way. I mean, I think that is joyful, engaged learning.
so
And
joyful.
teachers in any school context can do that. It's just that some of the IB schools have a running start because there's a framework that already exists that they're teaching into. Schools that don't have that framework
Have to create it.
have to create it,
Which,
or can also look at, some programs are better than others at this. And that the Reading League, which I mentioned before, they have a phenomenal curriculum evaluation tool aligned to reading science that I highly, highly recommend that school leaders and teams of teachers, roll up their sleeves and dig into in terms of assessing their current literacy curriculum and whether or not it's aligned to reading science. And as they vet, existing programs that are out there that are designed with knowledge building in mind from the start. But there is no perfect program. There's no perfect teacher or perfect day in school. But we do have to be really mindful of all of these facets of what it means to be a skilled or proficient reader, and children's background knowledge and vocabulary knowledge.
amazing.
Yeah.
I think it was such a beautiful example of a unit and that connection between joy, transdisciplinarity, applying literacy, just like a gorgeous example. So I guess that takes me to a spot in your book that left me a little bit flummoxed
Mm-hmm.
because this is when I was planning units, I would think through, okay, what is the problem that we're solving under how the world works? Or let's say it's a civilizations unit. And then my next step would be to think to myself, if I'm teaching civilizations, which text structure is most likely to support this inquiry? Civilizations, okay, we're going to be looking at informational text. And then I would typically move towards teaching strategies for reading informational text. Like that was kind of how my brain worked. But I guess when I was reading your book, it suggested that maybe that's not the best approach. So might you talk about comprehension and strategies and text structure and the shift there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think it's really important that educators realize that comprehension is an outcome of skills and processes, including word recognition and language comprehension, as well as other stuff like executive functions and motivation. And so comprehension isn't a skill in and of itself. It's the outcome of lots of skills and processes going on in the brain in order to understand and understand more deeply whatever it is that you're reading. And so what that means, both in terms of curriculum and instruction, is that what kids read really matters, and that strategies, while important, and they are important, it turns out that cognitive science really shows us it doesn't take all that much instruction for students to learn and apply comprehension strategies. It takes actually like very, very little instruction. And that makes sense, right, intuitively, but our curriculum maps the last 20 years have not always been designed that way. It actually takes more time and attention curricularly and instructionally to develop background and vocabulary knowledge than it does for kids to learn and apply strategies. So there's kind of a flip that has to happen with our curriculum maps and how we implement that curriculum. And to think about knowledge building as the driver or the major when it comes to our curriculum planning, and strategy instruction as the minor. And so strategies should always be in the service of knowledge building. We don't want to apply strategies in a vacuum, right? Or strategies for strategy's sake. So the second shift in our upper elementary Shifting the Balance book is about being more strategic about strategy instruction. And we really wanted to refresh the idea, but based on that 50-year body of interdisciplinary research, and kind of refreshing the ways we think about and talk about strategies with kids. And so we looked at this big body of research and identified what we call the strategic 6 thinking moves, because strategies are conscious thinking moves, right? You're like actively thinking about them. Eventually, those thinking moves are automatic and they actually become skills that you don't have to think all that much about. And we don't really want kids thinking about their thinking all that much, right? We want kids thinking about the content of what they're reading about. That's how you create comprehension. Strategies are just a tool to help me be more explicit about the kinds of thinking we want kids to do to know if they're really comprehending something.
Well, and if we're learning 1,000 strategies in a year, kids aren't going to automate those. It's going to be a cumbersome process of how do I select the best strategy versus an intuitive process.
Yeah.
But can you give an example of one of the thinking moves?
Yeah. So the first one is switch on what you know, which is our
Right.
kid-friendly language for activate prior knowledge.
Right.
But said in a way that kids will remember and respond to and apply more easily. Another one of our strategic 6 thinking moves is to map the text. So to your text structure example, we do want to give kids explicit direct instruction in the various text structures that exist in informational text or how narrative text structure typically works. We want to give kids access to that. But also, right, when kids are mapping the text, they are kind of summing up the text bit by bit as they go. We don't like map the text and we're done and dusted. We're doing that all the way across the text, an entire text. But we do want kids to pay attention to things like headings, right? And those text features that serve as signposts for you to know, oh, if I see that heading and I turn it into a question, I'm reading for the answer. That primes them to better attend to and retain the things that they're reading in the first place. But mapping the text involves noticing text structures, noticing those signal words, noticing those text features that ultimately help you form a stronger mental model, which is the point of reading in the first place. And if you aren't utilizing those strategies all that much, and you're not comprehending, right? Because maybe you're not consciously aware of them because they're already automatic. But if you're not consciously using them and they're not automatic yet, right, it's more likely that mental model is going to be fuzzy or inaccurate or just really surface level. And so the strategies are a way to help kids to activate and then dig deeper with whatever it is that they're reading about and to retain that new knowledge they're gaining from whatever it is they're reading. And I say knowledge, right? When we're reading fiction, we're also gaining knowledge, but we're gaining knowledge about how to be a better human as we make our way through the world. That's kind of what fiction gives us. But it's still an important form of knowledge. So I hope that answers your question.
It's so affirming and so clarifying for me. I hope that the audience feels the same way, that if I were to simplify it, it's like our priority is what is worth knowing. And that is what drives our literacy instruction, is what is worth knowing. And then as we turn towards those thinking shifts, it's how best might we know it? How best might we come to know it? And are those two central questions you might ask in your literacy planning?
Yeah, I love that. That's so thoughtful. And I think it's what's worth knowing and what are worthwhile texts.
Nice.
So part of this too is shifting from selecting texts for modeling and guided practice, where strategy was the reason for selecting it, that we could apply the strategy and kind of model that for kids, and instead selecting texts that are part of a larger conceptually coherent text set where there's something worthwhile about that text beyond strategy, right? And that maybe we're selecting text, of course, because they're in the service of knowledge building, but it might be a vocabulary rich text. It might be a text where the author uses really lyrical language. It might be a text that really offers a lot of opportunities for kids to turn and talk and stretch their verbal reasoning skills because there's something worthwhile to talk about.
Cool.
So yeah, I get really excited too about the ways in which reading science is helping us inform not only what's worth learning about, but also returning to taking more of a text first approach. And that what of all the texts in the world, right? Why this one? It shouldn't just be because it's offering a pathway to a strategy. It should be because there are these bigger reasons for reading it in the first place. And I've never seen kids like lean in on the rug because they can't wait to learn a new strategy, right? They lean in because they're like, I can't wait to see what happens next. Or I can't wait to learn this new piece of information and bring it back to the dinner table tonight. That's like what ignites curiosity in the first place.
Joy.
Yeah.
So, and all of these are so interconnected, which is so beautiful that they build on each other and they strengthen and enrich in each other as you learn about them, which is a really cool, I don't know, quality of your shifts.
Oh, thanks.
Speaking of which, the third shift
Yeah.
is about vocabulary development, which again feels really connected to this. So, might you speak a little bit about that shift?
Yeah, and absolutely. It's such an important point that in the creation of a book, right, we created this architecture where there were these 6 distinct shifts. But in reality, right, alongside students, the shifts are much more interconnected.
Fluid.
And right, it's far more fluid. It's not like now's our knowledge building time and now's our strategy time and now's our vocabulary time. It's all interwoven. But that doesn't make for a very good book. So, the work that I do and my colleagues do in partnership with schools is to understand the implementation of all of this, which is where the magic really happens for kids and for teachers. But, the other side of the knowledge coin, other than background knowledge, is vocabulary knowledge. Because if you know a lot about a topic or a concept, then you likely have a lot of words, right, for talking or writing about that concept or topic. And vocabulary knowledge has also been found to be a big factor in our ability to comprehend a written text, which makes a lot of sense because as a reader, you're making sense all along the way, one word and phrase at a time, to form that mental model. And if you have too many words that you don't know, that model gets fuzzy really quickly.
Right.
And vocabulary in the active view of reading by Nell Duke and Kelly Cartwright, they position vocabulary knowledge as a bridging process. And it's a bridging process because it cultivates stronger word recognition and language comprehension at the same time, right? If you know a word, it's in your lexicon, and you encounter that word in a text, you're more likely to accurately read it because you know the word exists versus if you don't, right? And it also is going to strengthen your overall comprehension of that text. And so a little vignette we give at the start of that shift in the book is about my youngest son, Matthew, where we were sitting at a stoplight. And as people will do, right, the driver behind me lays on the horn. And my son goes, the audacity of that driver. And he was like 8 years old at the time. And I was like, and my youngest son has dyslexia and dysgraphia, but typical of many kids with that profile, not all kids, but many kids, is that he has a lot of background knowledge and a really robust vocabulary. So those exist for him as great strengths, where there's kind of this gap between those strengths and his word recognition abilities, which is frustrating for kids for whom they have that profile. But he knows the word audacity exists. He knows how to use it in the right context. When he goes to encounter that word in, a 5th grade text or a 6th grade text, he knows the word exists. So even if he's like really sounding it out and doesn't have sight recognition of that word, the vocabulary serves as this bridging advantage for greater accuracy in reading and then ultimately also spelling the word because he knows it exists. There's something that can anchor him in that. And vocabulary knowledge can be developed more intentionally when we take a brain-friendly approach. One of the things that the science shows is there is no one right way to teach vocabulary. And we also cannot teach every word there is to know.
Right.
So, right. And also as humans, we never will know every word there is to know, right? The sky's the limit when it comes to that kind of knowledge. But we can be really intentional in our plans and in our instruction to make sure that we are sometimes teaching words implicitly. Like when I encounter a word in a read aloud and I define it on the fly for kids, that's more implicit instruction. But then we also do want to be intentional about lifting up particular words explicitly for kids, where we give them kid-friendly definitions. They see the word in context. We do a little bit of word analysis of that vocabulary word, where I might say, what are the sounds you hear in that word? Which letters represent those sounds? So there's a little bit of word reading instruction happening as a part of vocabulary instruction. And then we need kids to use the words. And I get really excited about the instructional possibilities for doing that. So that lots of kids, right, become kind of these vocabulary sponges like my Matthew naturally is, to pick up words and have word awareness and to know how to use words in the right context. I mean, that's one of the goals of vocabulary instruction too, is that they just have greater word use for speaking and listening, not just reading and writing. But I get excited about the possibilities for making vocabulary instruction both brain friendly, but also to allow that to be a social practice for kids. So one instructional routine that we lift up in the book is around interactive vocabulary walls, where you make choices about which words are going to matter most in this unit. You make them part of your environmental print, and you're kind of adding to that wall as kids learn new words over the course of a unit. And then a really great strategy is having those words available in baggies for kids, where they can start off categorizing words in lots of different ways. And then you might also give them baggies with different shaped arrows, where then they can really create concept maps using those words, where they're also stretching their verbal reasoning skills to explain the connections between words. And ultimately in their brains, right, we want this web of word senses for kids. And those kinds of hands-on exploratory approaches can really help with that. They're also really joyful and engaging. But they're not a substitute too for explicit direct instruction. They're a complement to it.
If I'm teaching, let's say, a 6-week unit default, how many words is an appropriate number of vocabulary words for a unit like that, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on your grade level. It depends on the word knowledge kids already have. But you want to have a mix of what are called tier 2 and tier 3 words. In the book, we talk about tier 3 words really as precision words. They're words that are more sophisticated, and you're going to encounter them in print more than you are out in the world or in conversation. But we also want to have those discipline-specific words that are particular to learning about that concept in science or social studies or art or math. That's also really important to include those. So it depends, but there are also vocabulary instruction could end up taking over your whole literacy block.
That's what I was thinking. It's like it could be the whole time. Yeah.
Right. And nobody has time for that. And so thinking about, 3 to 5 words a week,
Cool. Okay.
maybe more than that. The older grade levels, you might have like 5 to 8 words a week. But there's also kind of like a cognitive max of how much we can take in at any given time. But over a course of a 6-week unit, then you're really talking about like 20, 25 words.
Which is beautiful. That's a lovely, rich vocabulary to build.
Yeah, and giving kids access, to not only define those words, but know how to use them, know how to read them more automatically, and also know how to spell them is another piece of this.
I love it. Oh, I could talk to you all day. Shift 4, we're turning towards word recognition, which again, we've touched on a bit here. I feel like I didn't really teach word recognition as much in the upper grades. And I'm sure a lot of people listening are thinking, word recognition in the upper grades? Like, how do you do that? Like in lower elementary, we have sight words, we have lists of things and strategies, but what does that really practically look like in the upper school?
Well, you need to have a scope and sequence of the phonetic concepts that are taught in a particular order. And the truth is that a lot of children will not have mastered all of them by the end of 2nd grade, when things like phonics instruction sometimes stops.
Right.
And so a really important thing for upper elementary and middle school teachers to know is to have some assessment practices to know the word reading knowledge and the spelling knowledge that our kids have and what they don't. And also what's kind of uneven. And so, the truth is that a lot of kids won't have mastered that by the end of 2nd grade. And so in the upper elementary grades, it is, does have to be somewhat context specific in terms of what do your students know and not know. What is whole class? What is small group? Based on that assessment data. It has to include spelling because it's a lot easier for most students to read a word than to spell it. And spelling, I think, has really taken a back seat instructionally in a lot of schools, where just reading words and learning that phonetic pattern is not enough for a lot of kids. There needs to be daily, and if daily isn't possible, weekly dictation of those phonetic concepts where kids have opportunities to spell words and to spell sentences that contain the phonetic concepts they've previously learned. They need to be, writing for a lot of children is the road to reading. So we need to make sure that spelling is interwoven to phonics instruction from the start. But if it hasn't been, then we've got a lot of kids
Gotcha.
in grades 3 and up that just don't have it. And so spelling might also really be targeted in those upper elementary and middle school grades once we know what children know and don't know, and once you have a logical scope and sequence. Another thing too is there is no one scope and sequence. Research hasn't found one.
Right.
But it has to be logical, it has to be sequential, it has to be cumulative, and some programs do that better than others. And a big, big focus in upper elementary is also morphology, which is another, right? Morphological awareness is another bridging process like vocabulary, because morphemes are meaningful parts of words. And so a big focus in upper elementary is around those prefixes and suffixes and roots, or sometimes called bases, for kids to be explicitly taught, for them to practice, for them to use, and for them to apply in lots of reading contexts. And kids get really fired up about morphology instruction because they realize it unlocks, right? Like so many more words that they otherwise might have stumbled over, and that they can make more meaning in the process. So morphology is also a real target area for where to start. And there are some programs out there that can help guide teachers in how to do that.
It is exciting. Yeah, I think I found in my classroom that the kids who struggled with that sometimes hated that kind of instruction. Like it was like almost like we talked about the vicious cycle. Like it's just
Yeah.
something they're bad at. So they were like, can't I just type? It's like, how do you motivate those kids to do that practice of writing and spelling and the importance of that when it sometimes is just this lesson that they've learned? It's just something I'm not good at. I'm just going to type it.
Yeah, and I do think that the emotional underbelly of reading and spelling failure is really hard. And it gets harder the older kids get. And so, you're so wise to ask this question because we have to pay attention to that as teachers. But that there are methods that are explicit and direct and also engaging. And so, like a tried and true method for beginning readers, especially, are things called sound boxes or Elkonin boxes, because phonemes are invisible. They disappear immediately. And there are also particular challenges related to isolating, right, individual sounds in words and matching the letters that represent them, because those sounds are invisible. They get squished together because of what's called co-articulation when we speak sounds. And we're not hardwired to parse out individual sounds. That's not what our brains were designed to do. Our brains were designed to pick up on meaning as we make our way through the world. And so Elkonin boxes or sound boxes make that invisible, abstract work of sound knowledge more concrete, where every box, it's just 2-dimensional boxes, not 3D boxes, but where every box represents a sound. And there is research to support the use of manipulatives for kids to push a chip, for example, like a math chip, into each box as they say the sounds. And then there's lots of really important research on we need to have kids attach letters to those sounds as quickly as possible. And that we don't just want to do this sound-based work, in the air or in the dark. That we can also use sound boxes for kids to then match the letters that represent each of those sounds. As kids start to learn more multi-syllabic words, sound boxes don't work as well because you're dealing with 7 or 8 sounds in a word. But we can use things like whiteboards and have kids draw lines for each syllable that they hear. And then what are the letters that represent each syllable?
Cool.
What we really want to do is help kids break words into smaller parts because it makes it more manageable, right? It's more brain friendly to do that. And we also catch their inaccuracies more quickly, and they can get more immediate feedback in what they got right and what they got wrong, and how they can make it more accurate. So I get very excited. I use sound boxes. I use whiteboards all the time with my college students that I'm teaching for, both how to use these methods with their own students. But in a lot of cases, they're also learning the secrets of the code themselves.
Yeah.
Sometimes for the first time. They're like, I never knew that, right? Like, I never knew why it was spelled that way.
Oh, I want to be in your class.
Oh, thanks. We have fun. We have a good time. And sometimes there's the vulnerability, right? For a college student to be like, oh, like I looked at my neighbors. I didn't spell it that way. I
Yeah.
didn't realize. And so that's also a vulnerability, I think, for some teachers. If you feel like you were never taught the secrets of the code, there is a lot to know, but it's also a finite amount of knowledge because English has 26 letters, 52 if you count uppercase and lowercase, right? 52 symbols, 44 sounds, and about 200 graphemes or letter combinations that represent those sounds. The sky is not the limit, right? There's a finite amount of knowledge to know. And in the beginning, right, with beginning readers, you're just teaching sort of these one-to-one correspondence sound letter skills, and then eventually progressively building in more advanced phonetic concepts, which is why a scope and sequence is really important for schools to have so that it's not a haphazard approach to the access that kids have to those secrets.
Love that. Yeah. I always talk about curriculum as a blueprint. And it's like you might have 10 beautiful architects making a house together, but if they didn't make a blueprint, there's going to be 3 kitchens or there's not going to be a bathroom. And that's going to be a wonky house. Like if we're all coming together to design the blueprint, then we can be assured that the final product is going to be intentional.
Yeah, I'd recently heard, without a real intentionality around foundational skills development, I think this is true of literacy, but also math or like any subject area,
Anything. Yeah.
right? It's like trying to build a skyscraper on quicksand.
Smart.
And it's just going to disappear. And we do have millions of people that have been underserved and then shy away, right, from fully participating as readers and writers in the world through no fault of their own and through no fault of their teachers. They just didn't know what they didn't know at the time.
Totally. Yeah, there's no malintent, I think, in the way things have been done. And I think as teachers, it can be scary. Like I've always taught literacy this way, and nobody's shaming you. It's just saying, we're all scientists. Like we're all trying to use the best available data to grow and to learn. And yeah, I think not getting entrenched in that fear and shame and being able to have these open discussions is so important.
Yeah, and I think that it's such a real thing, those feelings of guilt and shame around kids that you could have served better in the past. You did the best you could with the knowledge you had at the time, and also what were sort of like popular programs du jour that were driving the field. But a big important thing too about the science part of the science of reading is that while there are some findings that we can rely on, science is never over, right? The field is moving forward all of the time. There are things that we're going to know 5 years from now that we don't know now.
Nice.
And just staying open to the idea of shifts. Shifting is just part of life. It's part of teaching and learning. Curriculum is always a living document, and it's always breathing and changing. And so is our understanding of how reading happens in the brain. That said, right, there are some things that we know that we didn't know before, but the field is continuously growing and evolving. And if something is a science, that's part of the nature of it, is that it is not fixed. That there are things like there are very hot topics right now around things like executive functions and working memory. And there's still a lot for us to learn about that and how it influences reading processes that researchers are uncovering right now, like in schools and in labs and using fMRI technology. And we're going to benefit from that 5 and 10 years from now.
That's going to be the reel of the episode. I always pull out the 1 minute clip, and that, I mean, I'm just like over here dancing because that's like, yes, yes, yes.
Yeah. And I know, there's so many people have been on your podcast around like inquiry. The science of reading is an inquiry.
Yeah.
Inquiry into how to better serve kids ultimately, in order, to level the playing field that all kids have the right to read. All kids have the right to become writers. And we can use findings from the science of reading as they evolve to help us better do that work as teachers And I think that Jan Carey and I have found sort of this sweet spot in being able to be these knowledge brokers, to be able to dig deeply into the findings as they evolve, which they continue to, and to make that accessible for teachers in a way that honors the hard work and the hard vulnerability stuff and the shame and fear and the overwhelm, with tools, right, to be able to start somewhere and to build momentum and to marry that with the head work. And I think that's some of the work that we do best and what we really tried to do with Shifting the Balance.
Well, it really is a success, and it's such a fun read. I'm mindful of, I want to talk about all 6 shifts, but I'm mindful of time, so I think I might skip fluency because I think we've talked, it goes in the same vein. The final shift, though, is about independent reading and some changes in how we structure that. And I think it's really transformative. So might we speak a little bit about those shifts in practice and beliefs in independent reading time?
Yeah, and I know this is a sacred topic for a lot of people. And we do want kids, one of the goals a lot of teachers have for instruction is that kids find themselves as readers, of course, right? And that they love reading. The truth is, all kids will not love reading, and that's also okay. But they also do need to have access, right, to the skills and knowledge and processes they need in order to become independent, agentive readers, whether they love it or not. And so those are vital skills for kids to have. When I visit classrooms all over, there are some where I see that kids have the knowledge and skills and processes, and independent reading of self-selected text is really worthwhile time. And then there are even kids within a classroom for whom that has not always been time well spent.
Nope.
Because it might be building disfluency rather than fluency, even though that was never the intention. It just was an unintended consequence. For kids who didn't have either the word recognition or the language comprehension skills intact enough, or both. And so then those are the same kids, right, that are sharpening their pencil a lot, frequent flyers to the nurse, or asked to go to the bathroom, or doing a lot of book shopping. And they've kind of been hidden in plain sight. And for them, large blocks of self-selected reading time has not been all that fruitful for them. And sometimes I witness kids, like I'll go in a classroom and I'll see like half of the kids are reading the same series book that I think they probably read last month and that they also read last year. And so then they're not developing those opportunities through that self-selection process to strengthen, their knowledge building, to strengthen their vocabulary building, or their knowledge of text structures and how authors craft language, because they're picking the same thing over and over again because it's safe. Right. And it's comfortable, and it's been in the name of agency. So it's complicated. I would certainly never be somebody to advocate for stripping away self-selected reading from children's reading diets, because I think that would be overcorrection. But that we do have to look at our instructional minutes. We do have to think about the value of teacher-selected text and rebalancing that with reader self-selected text. And there's also a lot of joy that can come from a shared text experience. There is a lot of joy that can come from challenging kids with a stretch text where they are guided and supported and scaffolded in ways that allow them to make meaning of that than they would have if they were on their own. And so like those Newbery winners, right? Your strongest readers are going to select them, but your weakest ones never will. And so how do we give them access to that rich content, to that beautiful language, to those powerful stories, if we aren't doing it together? And so I do think that's a really important, the number one question I'm getting asked from schools these days is about the block. How do you structure it?
Right.
How do you use those instructional minutes? And the answer often is it depends. But that one of the things to rebalance is to look at if kids have been given 30 or 40 or more minutes for self-selected reading every day, has that been worthwhile? And for a number of your students, the truth is it probably hasn't been. And so how do you reclaim some of those minutes for more teacher-selected text that hopefully are within a conceptually coherent text set, where you're living deeply, maybe within one novel over time. But there are also these complementary shorter texts all along the way, because one text can do a lot of good for kids. But multiple texts are going to allow that mental Velcro to develop and might pique particular interest or engagement for particular kids. So I get really excited about helping teachers to rethink their minutes and
Okay.
the ways in which there are like just so many beautiful, amazing books that come out in the world every year. And how do we make choices about which ones to lift up within that shared reading time?
So does that end up looking more like a book club rather than independent reading time?
That's one model, is that book clubs can be great. They also can go sour if they're not planned really thoughtfully, or if we're just basing the composition of those groups on oral reading fluency data, for example, and not thinking about other factors, right? Like,
Mm.
do kids ever get a chance to read with their friend? um, or like my oldest son, Jack, at one point in his elementary career was in a book club with all girls, and the protagonist was a girl, and he just didn't care.
Feel belonging.
Just
Yeah.
didn't care. Even though like the structure of the book club, right, was supposed to foster belonging and inquiry and rich conversation, it just didn't for him. But book clubs are fantastic, right? They can be really meaningful and beautiful experiences for kids. Um, and that there could be some scaffolded choice around the book club selections that kids have. But I also think teachers should not be afraid of things like whole class novels when used wisely and when the
Right.
text is a worthwhile text. Um, and when it is really a grade level complex text, and that rather than leveling text, which is maybe the paradigm the last 20 years, thinking about scaffolding texts instead. Because
Cool.
I think part of the fear for some teachers in making that shift to more teacher directed whole class experiences is we don't want reading to be sink or swim, right? We don't want to give kids things that we know they can't do and leave them on their own. But that's not what this is about. This is about scaffolding them through, at times, you doing a read aloud of that text, scaffolding through partner reading or book club conversations, scaffolding through close reading of really important excerpts,
Smart.
front loading vocabulary. Like there's so much we can do to scaffold those complex text experiences. But some kids have really missed out on
Yeah.
getting access to those in the first place.
It's I feel the personal cringe because I'm like thinking back to my own fifth grade classroom and thinking back to all those independent reading times, that you knew you saw the kid, the group of three boys in the back corner who you knew weren't reading anything and never would all year. And it's just like, again, it's like this wasted time. But
Yeah.
then on the flip side of that, I think I struggle because like as a reader myself, I know that like I'm not always in the mood to read too. And like especially after learning all morning and all day, like
Mhm.
saying like, okay, now go read a book. Like, I'm just not there. So yeah, it's hard. It's that hard balance of making every moment count and meaningful, and also just it's so many things to balance.
Yeah, there's so many factors, and this is the art of teaching part, right? There's
Yeah.
the science of reading, the science of learning, which is an even larger field, and then there's the art of teaching, and it's being responsive to the kids in your care, um, exactly like you described.
Woof. If you're a leader or a teacher hearing this and
Yeah.
just feeling overwhelmed, would responsivity kind of be your biggest answer, or is there other advice you'd have of just kind of where to start here?
Yeah, I think, well, in general, I think you want to start by celebrating the things that are already going well so that we don't throw the instructional baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
So celebrate what's going well. We need to do that way more often in schools
Oh,
because we need
yes.
to champion that, and we need to lift each other up because there are a lot of ways to be hard on ourselves in this work. So start with celebrating what's going well about any of these shifts.
Mm.
And then look for areas that are tiny tweaks or places to refine. Is independent practice one of them? Can you rethink those instructional minutes in some ways that are going to be really impactful in the long run? That might be a place to refine. And then I think the harder questions are, what do we need to start that we're not already doing? And what do we need to stop?
Yes.
Because it is either ineffective or it might just be inefficient. And what are we willing to let go of? And that's like the hardest one. And you might not start there, right? Um, I think sometimes there's a lot of enthusiasm to like dive right in and like, we're going to start this, we're going to stop that. But maybe a more human place to start is with what can we celebrate? What can we refine?
Mm.
Because it is going to take some vulnerability to start new things and to stop things that have maybe been beloved in your school. Um, so that's what I would suggest.
Awesome. A thinking routine that comes to mind from Harvard Project Zero is the start, stop, continue. And what I'm hearing you say is start with the continue and then
Mhm.
start digging into the start and stop and tread lightly. We're not going to fix it all in a year. So
Right.
celebrate what's working and then choose one shift,
Mhm.
choose one practice that you want to kind of dip your toes into and move from there.
Yeah, and I think that there are some shifts that are more urgent in certain schools. And
Yeah.
so also then having those brave conversations with colleagues about where's the urgency and
Beautiful.
are we willing to go there and address it and take stock and make changes? Because kids are only, first graders or fifth graders once. They're only here now. And they need us to bravely enter the waters of these shifts and to start to take action. But it is hard,
Right.
um, for sure.
Gorgeous.
Yeah.
Katie, what are you excited about these days? What works on your horizon or what things are cooking in your world that you're excited about?
Yeah, I'm excited you asked about that. So, an exciting project that I started to become a co creator of this past summer is called the Jumbaya Project. So, if you go to www.jumbaya.com, this is an online reading platform that I'm a co creator of that I'm really excited about the potential for. And my colleagues that are helping lead that work are just really thoughtfully minded about how we can apply what we've learned from reading science and marry it with what we know about culturally sustaining instruction, for example, and
Cool.
responsive learning and responsive teaching. So, this platform is designed with beautiful books at the center and organized in conceptually coherent text sets. We apply reading science to give them lots of tools to make that instruction reading science aligned. So we give them, for example, things like activation guides
Mm,
to help prime kids' knowledge before reading a text. We have fluency self assessments for kids. We have various vocabulary tasks, writing prompts, lots and lots of tools for every single instructional text. And we use a repeated kind of template so that once teachers have access to those toolkits, there's a predictable structure that they can fall right into for determining where do they want their instruction to go for their kids using this text. Another really exciting part of that platform is that we also have a software team and our curriculum team working on AI assessment tools.
cool.
Super cool, where we need to make it easier rather than harder to catch readers before they fall and to give teachers in the moment data on the word recognition and language comprehension skills that kids have, as well as their fluency.
Yeah.
So this AI assessment component to our platform is really intentionally being built based on what we know about how we can assess decoding and fluency and how we can assess language comprehension skills in children. And that teachers will immediately get that data, be able to apply it. We're not a substitute, for other really important assessment tools that schools are utilizing that are nationally and internationally normed. We're not at that
Mhm.
place yet, but we really are developing these progress monitoring tools that
Cool.
are quick, that are easy, and that can give teachers real time information. And can also direct them, to what makes sense in terms of next steps for instruction for that child.
So cool. Katie, I just admire the work that you're doing in our profession. I think it makes such a big difference. And the fact that you're training, like you said, I think before we press record, of just this next generation of teachers who are going to come in knowing this and knowing that instruction is going to change throughout their careers. It's just a beautiful mindset and disposition to develop. Um, and just selfishly for me, I've heard so much about science of reading, and it's felt like one of those things I kind of shy away from it. I just feel so much more knowledgeable and affirmed from this conversation. So just thank you so much for your knowledge and your time and making this so accessible.
Oh, thank you. And thanks for the invitation, Cindy. I likewise totally admire your work. I think you're having really brave and important conversations about teaching and learning and knowledge and inquiry and how schools can do this better. And that you're just a great support system for so many teachers and administrators out there. So I follow your work closely now.
Oh, so kind. Thanks, Katie.
Yeah, you're welcome.